This is why the kind of Type 5 city looks like a patchwork. There's a heavy concentration of one material that tends to be ubiquitous throughout a neighborhood, and then a heavy concentration of another. And that has to do with how building codes interact with other systems like zoning and like financial policies and approvals. So what ends up happening is that we're allowed to build this one type of structure in this place. We get approval for this one pattern, and then we build it over and over again in the same way in this neighborhood. What I found in this research is that starts to produce pretty different types of vulnerabilities across neighborhoods.
There's something unusual about American buildings. In most countries, structures are made out of either wood, concrete, brick, or steel. But in the US, 92% of single-family homes and 85% of multifamily buildings are made out of wood. The industry calls this Type 5 construction, and it quietly defines almost every corner of our built environment. To help us understand why this matters, we're joined by Jeana Ripple, architect, educator, and the chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Her new book, The Type 5 City, explores how America's reliance on wood changes not just our buildings, but entire urban regions. It's a complex and fascinating story, so we split the conversation into two parts. In the first part, we focus on the buildings themselves. In part two, we zoom out on the bigger picture, how wood construction reshapes cities, neighborhoods, and the future of urban life.
Most modern.
Going through the book, you have various case studies of various cities and how not only Type 5 has been deployed, but how policy has influenced that city to become the way it is. Can you walk us through maybe one or two of those examples and help us understand how policy impacts what our buildings are built out of? One
of the most fascinating things about doing this research was seeing how different these material maps looked across cities. I expected it to see similar patterns that, would repeat in certain geographies or in certain climates or cities that emerged at similar times, and they're drastically different. And I think the difference can be accounted for by, according to kind of local political will or priorities, material resources, and timing when the city grew. So a couple examples of that. Chicago, for example, we talked a little bit about, but after the Great Fire in 1871, there was a huge debate about whether the city should focus on letting workers rebuild cheaply with wood or pushing for safer, kind of more fire-resistant materials throughout the city. And in the end, the city compromised, so they slightly expanded the area where brick was required, but maintained both systems in the city. Philadelphia, on the other hand, is the most stark example of strict building codes. They completely banned wood construction about 30 years before the Chicago fire. They had one of the strongest skilled labor and craft cultures in the early United States, so there was enough political support for strict building standards early on. And then if you look at Seattle, the complete opposite. Seattle started to grow much later. So in the early 1900s, with a fairly transient population, people were coming to work, not necessarily interested in investing in, a long-term home for their family. And they really had limited access to robust materials like brick or stone. It starts to seem logical that a city like Seattle would have invested in better firefighting systems and been more tolerant of frequent building replacement and overall vulnerability. One of the things that you mentioned is there's these interest groups that really have a stake in how policy evolves and what we are allowed to build with. Can you, walk us through what are some of these interest groups and why do they come to the table with their perspective? We've seen this for decades. For over a century in the United States. Records of industry interest groups lobbying for certain building codes. So, for example, there are old records in Chicago about the Plasterers Association getting a last-minute change, 11th hour change to the building codes that people were really mad about, saying basically you need one more inch of plaster in order to consider this a safe, fire-protected building. So naturally, a Plasterers Association, that their work and their livelihood becomes affected by what we decide is a minimum default requirement. And so that has continued throughout, as these rules have evolved and practices have evolved. Labor unions tend to be very interested in building codes locally. Nationally, larger associations like home builders associations or product manufacturers have a stake in how these regulations are written and how they evolve. And so those are some of the groups that tend to pay very close attention, much closer attention than maybe the average occupant would pay to these rules.
Is that something, though, that the average politician should be able to understand? Like, I understand that the modern politician is not going to be able to understand every single detail about the economy, about the built environment, about all the things that they have to run. But is this something they should be paying more attention to, do you think?
I think so. I think communities should be paying more attention to this and therefore, kind of empowering politicians to pay more attention to it. Sometimes I've experienced a bit in practice with regard to not so much the codes, but the labor, that is, I think, becoming in a good way an issue that local representatives are more concerned, rightfully concerned with. Are the people who live in this community going to benefit in terms of jobs? Are they going to receive a benefit for the investment in construction locally? How we tie that into regulation, like how we think about who gets to build, who gets opportunities and what those opportunities are, and does that produce safer, healthier communities? I think that's where I think architects have to play a bigger role in interpreting, pointing out at least these are the trade-offs so that people can engage in that conversation.
Do you have like an example maybe of like a modern maybe community interest group that is doing this well, is understanding the code, is doing the marketing, is talking to the politicians on behalf of the average citizen? I
think the best example is probably in zoning. It's, the Comprehensive Plans act in that translation. They become a kind of translation medium to say, these are our goals. Let's agree first on the goals, and let's diagram what these rules might look like in our community, and let's talk about them. And oftentimes those will accompany or precede changes in zoning. Building codes aren't usually, I haven't at least seen them be part of comprehensive planning, but they could be. That could be a kind of similar translation medium, but I haven't seen that happen. Actually, there's maybe one example. The single stair, I think you all talked about, that you've maybe covered that. That's probably a good example. That's a building code issue that people have started to pay more attention to and realize this actually has a huge impact on urban form and affordability and variety. And let's start to visualize what that means and translate it to more people.
Yeah, I think the single stair is a really fascinating example because it really hinges between zoning and building code, as we're talking about. If you want to build taller, you're probably going to have to use a different material, but you also have to make sure the finances work. And so eliminating that space that would be used for egress, and using it as actually a usable space would be something that would allow you to maybe bridge that gap between a 6-story building and an 8-story building. And I think that similarly to what you're talking about, Jeana, it's also a fire code problem, right? If firefighters are primarily, from what I understand, the ones who are opposing institution of a reform in a lot of places because it makes it harder for them to do their job. And quite frankly, their job is very important. That being said, I think the single stair also emerged out of a big fire. Maybe it was a Chicago fire as well. And, or the double stair requirement.
The double stair requirement.
Yeah, the double stair requirement. And so it's a regulation for a different time at a different time, and we're facing different challenges that need to be reconciled.
That's one of the biggest ironies to me is like we not only regulate this one very specific and important but limited performance measure. The way it's tested is incredibly detailed. It's like this very specific furnace that has to test a small, piece of material to see how it performs. And then we kind of completely ignore all of these other factors, environmental, social, cultural, that are impacted. And we ignore the scale of the city. Like we're not, it's very odd to think in contemporary culture to think about setting up a rule that aggregates and not even looking at what it produces.
Right. And the name of your book is Type 5 City. It's not Type 5 Building. Can you paint us a picture for what that city looks like aesthetically, economically, culturally, environmentally?
Alex, you asked about this earlier, but the Type 5 city, it's an important distinction because Type 5 construction makes a lot of sense in a lot of parts of the country or the world. But in cities in particular, the stakes are different. The average age of structures in cities is almost double. So it goes from kind of a 40-year average lifespan in the United States to like 80 or 90 years in a lot of American cities. Of course, the risks are compounded with a more population, and there's an argument for maybe a kind of different kind of long-term investment in cities that we should be paying attention to. You also asked about why do we see a kind of rinse and repeat? Why do we see certain neighborhoods that are almost all one type of construction? And this has a lot to do with the building codes. This is why the kind of Type 5 city looks like a patchwork, not necessarily not in many places like a diffused pattern. There's heavy concentration of one material that tends to be ubiquitous throughout a neighborhood, and then a heavy concentration of another. And that has to do with how building codes interact with other systems like zoning and like financial policies and approvals. So what ends up happening is that we're allowed to build this one type of structure in this place. We get approval for this one pattern, and then we build it over and over again in the same way in this neighborhood. What I found in this research is that starts to produce pretty different types of vulnerabilities across neighborhoods. So sometimes even in areas of the city that might be facing similar kind of economic struggles, they have very different material characteristics, and that produces different patterns of foreclosure or different levels of abandonment and disinvestment. These kind of material patchworks become a factor in the community, and different types of material performance that we should be worried about at the scale of the city.
I want to jump in here with a dumb question. Talk about building code, talk about zoning, and there seems to be a tension between the two. Why are they two different systems?
Because we have planning school and we have architecture school.
Yeah, right. We have planners and we have architects. Zoning emerged later. The way I talk about building codes in the city is really kind of building ordinances. So even before they were sort of discrete standalone codes, they were regulated through city ordinances and things like these kind of geographic fire limits. In some cities that started in the 1600s and 1700s, those kinds of ordinances. Zoning, famously, like the New York City zoning in 1916 was the first citywide zoning. So it was a much later instrument that was seen as a way to control some of the market forces that, produce density in ways that people were starting to think that were causing problems they wanted to avoid. Ironically, in New York, that shift happened just as they were starting to develop the kind of low-lying floodplains in Brooklyn and Queens. So the shift to kind of regulate single-family zoning in New York and allow wood frame construction forced them, or at least produced a pattern of vulnerability that is completely illogical when you look at the environmental patterns of the city. Do they have to stay that way is another question that maybe we could all think about together.
I think that they need to be more and more closely
connected.
aligned. And where I'm in San Francisco, I know the Department of Building Inspection and the Planning Department, they're in the same building. They operate somewhat together and they dialogue a little bit, but they are distinct. It's like different departments within one large organization. And I do get the sense that they don't work closely enough together. Like, again, in San Francisco, we're upzoning. I've seen the maps. They're all plans. Okay, this district is going to go to 85 feet and this district is going to go to 65 feet. And that's a different color than this one. But you never see the section. You never see the elevation. You never see what that's actually going to look like at a building scale. And I think that's something that probably as the city is leaving up to the market, basically developers and contractors, to figure out if it's feasible. I'm sure they're doing some research on the back end, but I don't think it's as integrated as we need it to be in order for it to be totally beneficial.
The other piece is that the data is collected by city assessors. So now you've got a third entity, the data on what we build out of. So you've got the building regulators, the zoning policy regulators, and then those who are actually like collecting data about what we've produced, all completely disparate systems, sometimes to the point that, particularly early on when I started this research, but still in some cases, it's really difficult to map the material patterns because the assessment doesn't even use things like the same parcel numbering system as those who are, recording some of the parcels and building mass and things like that. So I think you're right. I think there needs to be a more kind of holistic, synthetic look at this in the way that cities are even organizing their own information and conversations.
Yeah, I think that's an area for a data engineer like Lebo to jump in and really streamline all this stuff, because I do think that that's one of their major problems, just knowing a little bit of how it works. Like you have all this stuff all over. Some are photocopies, some are PDF, some are Excel. It's like the data is just not really cohesive. And in this modern era, when we can really create robust databases of our physical environment, it seems quite regressive.
Especially as we look to make more decisions based on data analysis and performance analysis. We need better data in this area to help us understand what's happening and what the trade-offs are.
I mean, having looked at New York's public data, it doesn't seem like the government is trying too hard to make it not only accessible, but also in a way that you can put these data sets together to understand kind of higher level conclusions about what is happening. But is this a uniquely American problem, or does the tension between building code and zoning and policy like happen everywhere?
It's not entirely uniquely American. There's a few other countries where wood frame building is more common, and I think we can learn a lot from some of those locations. For example, Japan has a long history of building with wood, but it's also kind of part of a cultural expectation tied to regular maintenance and kind of seeing the keeping of the condition of wood buildings as a shared responsibility. Or Australia, we talked about a little bit earlier, where the codes also reflect a high level of environmental awareness. So detailed guides on what wood species are most appropriate for certain climate zones. So it's not only the United States that builds out of wood, but it is unique when we compare to other countries like Europe, for example, where to build cities out of wood is very uncommon in Europe. And even the conversation, I've talked to colleagues just about, okay, how is contemporary construction evolving in European cities, and is this a debate? And the cultural preference is so strong by now that people wouldn't even think to build out of, that would be seen as too flimsy, too unsubstantial. The market preference has been, and the cultural preference has been shaped by the regulation, and vice versa. It continues to kind of shape the way that evolves.
Something interesting about Japan, which famously builds really beautiful wood buildings, they also don't build for eternity. They build for buildings that will be demolished after a couple generations. There's one line in your book which has really stuck out to me. The average residential building age is 88 years in Chicago, 90 years in New York, and 51 years in Seattle. I think it's really concerning that most of our buildings are older than we are. What do you think about that?
I think for me, it goes back to thinking about, could we build in certain places in the city and in certain places in the building in ways that are meant to last centuries, and then recognize that others are going to necessarily and more appropriately be built to be more temporary. This is a type of construction that we're starting to see emerge a little bit more in Europe. So there's a group called the Open Building Network that looks at trying to build kind of robust, flexible frames and allow for residents to maybe even just buy the shell and infill according to their own financial capacity, or choose from a kind of kit of options for the infill. And the idea being that, you kind of centralize the services and build a really robust structure, but some portions of the building should be designed to change frequently according to taste and cultural evolution.
95% of new single-family homes? But housing policy is a hot topic right now. Type 5 is the most ubiquitous, the easiest, probably the most affordable way, the most flexible way we can produce housing. But from a policy standpoint, we hear politicians talk about rent freezes, affordable housing grants, inclusionary zoning, but we never really hear about materiality and how our buildings are built. So what is your recommendation? Is materiality something we should be designing policy around?
Absolutely. I think, just like zoning, that we need to be understanding the trade-offs. We need to be thinking about how material, if we think about housing as an infrastructure, which I think, even though it hasn't gotten in depth in terms of material, people are starting to think about it that way. We need to think about different costs, risks, long-term impacts, opportunities, even the kind of conversation we were having earlier about, does the complexity of this system start to decrease the productivity of housing? I think we need to take a really careful look at building material as part of the policy debate.
Can we just lay some of this out there? Because, for instance, I think wood, as we've mentioned before, it sequesters carbon, it's renewable, doesn't have the same impact that concrete or steel does on the environment. At the same time, it's less durable, it's less resilient. You might have to replace it more often. So how do we start to make these decisions? And, it's sort of a phenomenon in our contemporary times. You can't have it all. We can't just pick the things that we want to work and expect them to work. We're going to have to create a combination and start to have trade-offs. So when it comes to building, let's say talk about the sustainability lens. What are some of the frameworks we can use to maybe think about how to do this the most smart way possible?
I think we need to have a better understanding of building typologies and durability impacts, because that as a part of the sustainability question. So my preliminary analysis, I was seeing 20-year lifespan difference is about if you have to replace a wood building 20 years more frequently than a concrete or steel or brick building, the sustainability benefits start to invert at that point, because that upfront cost is a significant part of the overall energy footprint. That needs to be proven out. And we don't have a lot of data. We don't have typical typologies and material quantities to work with yet. But we could. And so as we look at that, I think we could start to have a more sophisticated conversation about when is it worth it for us to invest in a kind of a longer term system, and how do we build that system to enable it to actually become sufficiently flexible to stand for 100 years. Versus when do we need to accept that this is going to be a shorter term solution, and maybe build with simpler techniques to acknowledge this. We don't need to build this to last 100 years. We can keep this wood frame construction more simple, maintain it more often, and approach it with that expectation.
One thing we haven't talked about is actually what these buildings look like. There's a certain aesthetic to a wood frame building, or let's say a suburban environment or a 3-story urban environment that people are attracted to. I think it has a lot to do with nostalgia. I think it has a lot to do with what you grew up with and what you're comfortable with. Both Liba and I, actually, we moved to the United States at an early age, and we grew up in concrete buildings, and we came here and it's a completely different environment. So that was a bit foreign to us. So I'm curious how aesthetics plays a role in that culture, how people vote with their wallet, but also cast votes to say, let's keep the neighborhood looking a certain way and not turning it into something else. How does the actual look and feel of the city play into or relate to wood frame and type 5?
Sometimes we see that come into the regulation or even financial incentives in an interesting way. For example, there are areas in Northern Virginia where there's a kind of tax incentive for using brick as a cladding material, not necessarily as a structural material, completely related to kind of aesthetic preferences and what this community wants, the kind of development it wants to encourage. But that, again, should be connected to looking at, okay, what's the kind of energy footprint of just that incentive policy, and is that worth it? I think the other huge preference has to do with scale and, single family housing. In addition to maybe the aesthetics, it's of course a huge debate in American cities, in a lot of American cities right now that are considering upzoning, whether to maintain that kind of single family scale, which is usually through the building codes is kind of connected to type 5 construction as a default. I thought you were going to ask maybe about the aesthetics of the multifamily wood frame construction, which I don't know if it's a cultural preference, but it's certainly becoming ubiquitous. As that in 2015, the U.S. model codes adopted a kind of more lenient approach to how many stories of wood frame construction could be stacked on top of each other. So that is known as a kind of 5/1 mid-rise building, 5 levels of type 5 over 1 level of type 1 or concrete. And it immediately became a new default. So I've heard some people call it a stumpy building, but it's very common. It's hard to go to a kind of mid-size or growing city and not see these buildings popping up everywhere. And it controls the aesthetic because of the way the building is structured. There's kind of limited variety that can be introduced into that way of building.
Right. And I think the 5/1 has been criticized quite a lot for being banal, for being boring, for lacking ornament. I think one thing that distinguishes the 501 is it's just the most efficient, right? Like in terms of building code, in terms of zoning, in terms of constructability and finances, it is the sort of end point of all of those calculations coming together.
Absolutely.
But what you end up seeing is that's usually happening maybe on the fringe, on the outskirts, where there's more available land because there's bigger buildings there,
Yes,
or bigger building sites, or in a very suburban environment like Phoenix or Houston or somewhere like that where density is already kind of lower. I do think that it's something that is probably the most recognizable aspect of what we're talking about here. Like if we're going to point an icon to a lot of the effects of this, it's that 501 where you have, I don't know, a Dave & Buster's on the bottom, and then you have a bunch of condos with millennials living in them with their dog and whatnot. But
absolutely.
it's important to bring that up.
But that sounds like the dream state, living above a Dave & Buster's. What else do you really need? But it's interesting that like throughout this conversation, we've talked about kind of these defaults that emerge that kind of become ubiquitous, like the cookie cutter house, the 5/1. Why do we coalesce around these defaults?
I think because, building codes set a minimum standard that the way one author that I was reading about in, kind of early Chicago described it is there will always be a need for the kind of most affordable, lowest common denominator option that as soon as that exists, it will have staying power in the cities. And I think there's also a lot of attention to economics. So in Seattle, for example, as they were one among the first, some of these West Coast cities to experiment with taller multi-story wood frame construction. And there was concern about whether it would burn. But they started experimenting with it in the areas that had ladder trucks. So they were, once again, kind of tying this more lenient approach to firefighting capacity. And the building official at the time said, we want to avoid a safer is better approach, that it's not necessarily true. We want to have a reasonable degree of safety and promote affordability. So there's kind of this heavy interest in upfront affordability as a driver. And I think that's why we see these kind of defaults becoming such a standard. I would like to think that we could start to increase attention to some of the longer term effects or even some of the other social benefits of building with more robust construction, like providing job opportunities, for example.
Alex, you work on affordable housing. It's probably something that's very hard to make work economically, depending on where you are, what site you're building. How hard is it to go beyond kind of the minimum requirements?
Okay, so for instance, I'm working on a project that's going to be the tallest building in the city, but it's only going to be 3 stories tall. And so it's going to be wood construction for sure. I think there's a lot of focus on the planning. So one nice thing about that project is we actually have a lot of space, and because the density requirement is rather low, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can do in that environment. The plan is, I can post it here. It's quite interesting, actually. It's kind of, you have a lot of open spaces. You have all these adjacencies that you wouldn't normally have. Now, yesterday I was looking at a site in a much denser environment, and when you have a smaller site, you still might be doing wood frame. It might be 5/1. Maybe we'll go to a different construction type, but the opportunities for something are much more restricted. It's probably going to be a double-loaded corridor, kind of like that hotel configuration, a single move, maybe a kink here. And in that case too, our major restriction is actually parking. And as of right, we wouldn't be able to design something affordable in that lot because the requirements for parking are just too onerous. So there's all these trade-offs, and there's all these ripple effects that come out of this. If we were to actually push that project forward, we would say we need to reduce the number of parking spaces. This would allow us to maximize our units. We could also do something a little bit more interesting, but you're really working within the margins in America. And it's not just affordable housing. If this were a market rate project, it would still be like that. You just wouldn't be getting government subsidy. So I'm trying to figure out what it is. It's all this context. It's part of this ongoing project for the podcast is trying to figure out, especially in this context, what restricts and what enables. But man, I would say it's tough right now. And, that's why a lot of buildings are basically facade studies. Is this going to be a purple building? Is it going to be a polka dotted building? Is it going to be a striped building? And I think that's a bit limiting as a designer. At the same time, I think if you start to unpack some of the finances, some of the, let's say, the programmatic models, and there is some room there, but it's tough. This
is kind of ongoing work for me. I'm trying to collaborate with some colleagues who are interested in testing, through kind of data data systems and simulations, like what are the levers that may have the most impact, and tax economists and policy analysts, and interviews with developers and affordable housing developers and other developers to really understand, like, where are the decisions being made, where are the restrictions or the levers that we could pull to start to influence the options. Because it does feel like, I've encountered this as well, that there's, both in practice and interviews with contractors and developers, that people feel like, I don't actually have a choice. The market, the labor force, the financial system, what risks I can take and what risks I have to avoid are all driving so many decisions in this space.
I would say the bottom line is the biggest thing. How much is the whole building going to cost? Our per unit cost in the Bay Area is usually around $600,000 to $700,000, which is a lot. I mean, even if for affordable housing, like if you were to sell that at market rate and get a 20% markup, those are $850,000 units that are 500 to 600 square feet. Like, it's really small. So, that's just a number that we can't really control based on material cost, based on labor cost. It's not really a soft cost. I know my architecture fee. It's not that crazy,
right,
as a percentage of the building cost. And so I think that, but we're in this catch-22 where it's hard to build buildings because there's enough labor, because there aren't enough people who actually live in the environment, in the place that they're building. They have to commute from far away. They can charge a lot. There isn't enough competition. We're kind of stuck in this moment. A lot of things we talked about policy-wise are trying to unstuck that. What you're talking about, Jeana, is actually looking at the actual element itself and trying to find ways at a sort of micro scale that could maybe help with that unsticking. But as Libo has pointed out, I think they need to communicate between, up and down the scales.
Alex, I've heard different answers to this question when I've asked it, and I'm curious as to whether you've encountered it. I've asked questions about our market rate and affordable housing, like, let's say your typical mid-rise structures, as likely to be stick frame as they are to be, metal studs. And sometimes people say, yeah, we just make that decision based on what the market and most affordable product is at that moment in time. And other people say, no, we do all of our market rate housing, especially if we're going to sell a condo, out of metal studs, because we don't want to take on the liability of the potential expansion, contraction kind of vulnerabilities. And we only do multi-story wood frame for affordable housing. Have you encountered any of that?
Not so much.
One way or the other?
Not so much. I think the other thing too is, like, I'm in the Bay Area, so seismic plays a big role in that, and sort of the building culture around that. But I could see it too from just a marketing standpoint. If you're going to sell somebody a condo and you're going to want them to feel like this is something they can live in for a long time, you probably want it to be in a more robust material. You don't want the floors to warp. You don't want there to be a lot of mold coming in and out of the building. The one aspect of affordable housing, which is what we concentrate more on, which really gets overlooked by architects and especially by kind of design, is the maintenance of it. One ramification of having a poorly performing building, I'll give you a very specific example, is that it's hard to find people to maintain the buildings. And one of the limitations on affordable housing developers is it's really hard to find somebody who's actually going to be the on-site maintenance person for that project. And so a lot of their decisions, like, if we design a building this way, let's say we paint it white, is it going to be hard to make sure it stays clean? And is it then going to be hard to make sure that so-and-so is going to want to stay on our project and take care of it? Because it creates all these other pressures for the entire ecosystem of providing the housing. It's all really intertwined, and I continue to learn more and more about it. But I think there's no one sort of all-size-fits-all solution.
So I think the saving grace is we do live in a democracy. The average voter does have an incredible amount of influence and impact over not only what we do as a nation, but also what we do as a local community. So I guess other than running out there and getting your book and like reading through it, what are the ways that maybe the listener out there who's like, I want to educate myself more about this problem, more about all the things that impact, like what are some of those pathways to educate?
I think, starting to kind of pay attention to what, even just understanding, like, how has regulation evolved in my own community? It does look a little bit different in every city, what codes they've adopted, when they adopted it. So even just kind of looking at what is the current building code, what is the current, what's allowable in my community, starting to participate maybe in, there are also kind of opportunities for comment and participation in model code development. So that's another area where I think people can become more involved. I think, as we've talked about, asking questions as a consumer about, to kind of be informed about what is this going to mean for me in terms of maintenance is another important role that the average person can play in this conversation.
Yeah, I would like to advocate for design education to focus more on construction. Like, how many students actually have nailed a 2x4 together? I think that would be really helpful to start to understand from the foundation, like, this is how a lot of projects come together, and this is what it's actually going to get involved. This is what's going to happen once you model it up in Rhino.
Yeah, to understand the defaults, and then I think also be able to kind of consider them from not just, this is how we do it, but what are the impacts? There's different choices that have been made in different places over time. It was really interesting to me to read about Max Bond talking about the kind of social labor implications of material choice, and that he would make in his firm material decisions in the 80s based on like union representation in that local community. And that's something that, like, talk about a kind of impact that architects can have. We're the ones that specify, even if it's just the outer cladding of a material. That's not something I had heard discussed in architectural education, and it seems like a really low-hanging fruit in terms of ways that we can impact communities.
You both teach. Do you see that trend shifting in academia right now, or is this something that maybe you guys are at the forefront of, thinking that this is something that we need to change about architecture education?
I think it depends on the school, but I do think that there's more diverse ways to practice today, and that means that there are more educators that are still involved in practice, from what I'm seeing. And I think that helps. It helps, like, these kind of practical conversations enter into academia and vice versa. There's also more opportunities for architects to be involved in research, or there may be more there's more incentives for architecture academics to be involved in research, where traditionally it was more of an apprenticeship model, like you know how to design and you teach. Now there's a lot of expectation that you're involved in research, so that also helps us figure out how do we move these conversations forward that rely on pretty in-depth understanding of the building industry, but through forms of testing that may traditionally have been more prominent in other disciplines.
Yeah, I think my reflection is, based on my previous comment, is that, like the rest of the world, we're moving to a more digital understanding of things and more digital practice. At the same time, our discipline really involves physical outcomes. And so I think, like, even for me, just as a reminder to get off my computer and start to experience things either through construction, actually seeing how things are assembled, or just interacting with the physical environment more, I think that would be really helpful as we start to consider other things like AI and machine learning and digital design and all those sort of things. Remember what the physical outcome is going to be at the end of the day. I think that would be a good reminder for pedagogy at the moment.
Throughout this whole conversation, we've talked about building code and zoning and policy as this kind of restrictive thing, limiting what we could build, limiting the potential, limiting the possibilities. Is that the right way to look at these?
I think traditionally building codes have been all reactive, all about managing risk, but the way we're talking about it is really a shift to thinking about them as proactive, that we could connect the ways we think about building materials, for example, to construction work, which has often helped stabilize or grow economies. We could think about the way we build and the way we regulate building to incentivize different forms of occupancy and use that might lead to opportunities for small businesses. Or we might think about the longevity of buildings being a resource, actually, for cities long term, to kind of stabilize, create healthy communities, and kind of shape the way that our communities can interact.
If I'm a listener out there who's in a rush to get your book, where can I find it?
So the book is available. You can order it on Amazon or through the University of Texas Press.
Amazing. And we'll be sure to include links to those. And Jeana, if people want to find out more about you, more about your research, where can they find you?
I'm at the University of Virginia. Please reach out with any thoughts or comments. I'm looking for collaborators on this to kind of continue to think about how we might study it.
So for those collaborators, what's your pitch? Like, who are you looking for? What do you want them to come to the table with?
I would love to see more researchers probing the impacts of material patterns across cities, kind of looking at it from an economic standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, social scientists who might be able to, look at sophisticated correlations. And I am starting to work with a more diverse group of collaborators myself here at the University of Virginia, but I think it's because it's such a multifaceted issue where we're dealing with tax policies, we're dealing with labor opportunities, we're dealing with market incentives, we're dealing with social priorities. I think it really requires a robust set of perspectives and expertise to weigh in.
So listener, if you're out there and you fit into one of these buckets, please reach out to Jeana, because I think not only is the book really compelling, really insightful, but it kind of tees up this amazing research for the future that not only, I think, digs into why our world is shaped this way, but also what we can do and kind of regain that agency we feel like we've lost with the world around us. This has been really exciting, Jeana. So it's really exciting for me to ask our always final question to you. Let's say, 30 years from now, you're maybe writing another book and you're looking back on our current time. How would you describe the current time?
30 years from now, I hope we have more diverse viewpoints that we can see evidence of more diverse priorities in the built environment that we occupy. I think right now we're so monolithic in terms of the way we regulate, the kind of bottom line influence on the way we build, the factors that we consider, and I hope that we can look back and say, oh, now we have a much more sophisticated awareness, and we can see evidence of different communities that might prioritize different possible outcomes in the built environment.
The book is called The Type 5 City. It is out right now. We will attach those links to the show description. Thank you, Jeana, for this wonderful conversation.
Lebo and Alex, thank you so much. This was, you posed good, challenging questions that I'll continue to think about, and I really appreciate it.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Jeana Ripple. If you're looking for part 1 of this interview, please go ahead and click right here. And don't forget to subscribe to Most Modern and like the video.